Hi, everybody. I'm Josiah. I use he, him, his pronouns, and I've been organizing with Sunrise for just over a year. Outside of Sunrise, I'm a full-time student attending a local community college. I joined this movement because I believe in fighting for a better world.
Hi, everybody. My name is Celia. I use she or they pronouns. I've been organizing with Sunrise for about a year and a half. And outside of Sunrise, I work in communications and food justice. And I'm part of this movement because I'm fighting for a world where we have a fundamentally different relationship to the land and to each other.
What is up, everyone? My name is Jacob. I use he, him pronouns, and I've been organizing with Sunrise for just over a year. I work in construction, do infrastructure projects, and I joined Sunrise to fight for liberation for all people.
Hello, everyone. I'm Angela. I use she, her pronouns. I've been with Sunrise for about 8 months, and I'm in this movement to fight for a meaningful and joyful home for everybody.
All right. We also had a team of amazing people working behind the scenes. We appreciate each and every one of their contributions, whether they could be with us the entire time, they could just be with us today, or they were with us at the very beginning. They contributed to each and every part of this teach-in to make it a success. Thank you to each and every one of them.
So we know that people are coming to this space from a lot of different places, both physically where you're at, and also in terms of what we're bringing to the space. So we're gonna start the teaching off by reading off some welcomes, and if any of them resonate with you, please put a star or a plus in the chat. So first, we wanna welcome people of all ages, whether you're in middle school, high school, or college, whether you're a teenager in your 20s, 30s, or an older ally, you are welcome here.
We want to welcome people of all racial and ethnic backgrounds. Whether you identify as Black, Indigenous, White, Asian, Latinx, or mixed race, you are all welcome here.
We want to welcome people of all genders and sexualities. Whether you're trans, non-binary, cis, queer, or straight, you're all welcome here.
We want to welcome people of all socioeconomic classes, whether you're working class, middle class, owning class, or anywhere else on this scale. You are most welcome.
We want to welcome people whose families are supportive of this work, as well as those of you whose families don't even know you're on this call. We welcome you.
We want to welcome those who may be feeling nervous about being here today. Maybe you haven't considered if the work you've done in the past could be called organizing or activism. You're welcome here.
And now we want to open it up to you all to give your own welcomes. Please feel free to drop them in the chat and we will read some of these out. Welcome to anyone living with disability. Welcome to people of all levels of education. Anyone in the working class. Yes, thank you, welcome you all. And now Jacob, over to you.
So we wanted to start off today by doing a land and water acknowledgement to honor the Indigenous peoples whose land we're on and who are still here defending this land in spite of a system which continues to oppress them. So we're going to have everybody pull up the website native-land.ca and drop in the chat whose land you're on as a way to show solidarity with Indigenous people and ground ourselves in the knowledge that we are living on Indigenous land. Thanks, William. Thanks, Bree. Thank you, Nancy. I saw people doing this earlier when we were starting to. Thanks, Kylie and Jesse and Lori. It's all great. Thank you, everybody, for doing that. On the next slide, Celia is going to walk us through some teach-in norms.
All right, so we would like to ask everyone to just really take a moment to center yourself, get ready for a couple hours of awesome learning and interaction and just inspiring stuff. So please remove any distractions, get a beverage if you need it, some water or some tea maybe. If you're a note taker, feel free to get, a notebook or, something to take notes with. Just want to note that we will be recording this teach-in and sending it out to everyone afterwards. So if you want to just listen, don't want to worry about taking notes, you can always watch it later, and you can also share it with your friends. And lastly, just take a moment to center yourself, be here, and get ready to learn. If you have any tech problems or logistical questions, you can private message one of the moderators. They have the name moderator in all caps in their Zoom name, and they can help you out. During the teach-in, you can use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your Zoom window to ask questions. We'll be gathering these questions and we'll answer some of them during our Q&A session at the end of the teach-in. You can also use the chat throughout the session to react to what's being presented. So if something being discussed on the slides or in the chat really resonates with you, you can draw plus signs to show your support for that point or conversation. Throughout the teach-in, we will also have moments where we will invite you to share your thoughts on certain topics, to interact with us, respond. So we really encourage you to participate via the chat during those activities. And lastly, we ask for you to be here with each other and be present with this community to learn and grow together. We are creating a safe space for community learning, so we will not tolerate any bullying or hateful language in the chat. And we do have moderators who will be monitoring the chat and kicking people out if any of that happens, so that this remains a safe space. So now I'm going to pass it on to Angela.
So to help structure our slides for you, we have a couple of different symbols that serve as markers for different content. This ribbon symbol acknowledges the start of a new section. The asterisk denotes a moment for active participation in the chat. We will be having one break halfway through the teach-in today, and at the end of each section, we will have a set of key takeaways to help recap what we just covered. So now I'll hand it over to Josiah.
Thank you for that, Angela. Today's teach-in is part of the Sunrise Movement's Good Jobs for All campaign. For those of you who may not be familiar with the Sunrise Movement, we're a movement of young people that are organizing to stop climate change and create millions of good jobs in the process. For those of you that may have attended our last teach-in in April during Earth Week, we wanted to quickly note that while that teach-in was focused on the Green New Deal more broadly, today's kickoff teach-in will center us around why and how this campaign meets the moment we are in. Our movement is running the Good Jobs for All campaign in response to the once-in-a-generation opportunity that we have right now to build pressure and put pressure on our members of Congress to pass bold legislation that can truly launch the decade of the Green New Deal. We will be delving deeper into the campaign. Of course, our vision of the Green New Deal is more than just one bill or program. We'll be delving deeper into the campaign and discussing how you can get involved later on in the teach-in. But for now, we'd like to take a brief moment to outline the two biggest goals that Sunrise has for this campaign and for this year. The first is to win millions of good-paying union jobs through the creation of a new game-changing national program, the Civilian Climate Corps. Now, what would that program look like? What would those jobs look like? They would ensure a livable wage and strong benefits for workers, all while doing meaningful work that's fighting climate change as well as the many other crises before us. Our movement has been in the streets and organizing for 4 years to get us to a place where we can even talk about passing federal climate and jobs legislation. And now is the time for us to put something into law. Of course, the vision of the Green New Deal is more than just one bill or program, and it will take years to achieve. So the second goal is that we're going to continue to grow our people power for future wins by talking to our communities about the Green New Deal, Good Jobs for All, and reimagining what is politically possible in this country. In other words, we need to set our movement up to continue getting wins that tangibly improve people's lives throughout the rest of the Biden administration and beyond. Which brings us back to why we are here today and why hubs are hosting teach-ins around the country as part of the Good Jobs for All campaign. That's right. Throughout this month, Sunrise Hubs will be leading locally focused teach-ins with their community, talking about what good jobs would mean for their cities and towns. So, why host teach-ins? A teach-in is a space for community learning for the purpose of taking collective action. And that is what we're here to do. You see, teach-ins build our people power by creating a forum for our movement to connect with our broader community about the issues we face and how we solve them. We can even see teach-ins as a multi-tool tactic for recruiting new members, training current members, strengthening partnerships with local organizations, and building public support. For both this teach-in today and the hub-led teach-ins to follow, we will be grounding ourselves in the Green New Deal's vision for a livable future and good jobs. Indeed, for many of us, learning about the Green New Deal for the first time sparked our imagination, gave us hope, and brought us into the movement. And that's exactly the kind of energy we want to build through the teach-ins. Okay, so let's quickly review what we'll be covering today. We're going to be talking about the crises we face and how we got here, what the Green New Deal is, common criticisms of the Green New Deal and how to respond to them, Biden's America Jobs Plan and the political moment we're in, what kind of power we need to build in our communities to win, how climate solutions are good jobs, and finally, how we will win good jobs for all. We'll be going through a lot in a short amount of time, but we'll have activities spread throughout with some breaks as well so that we don't get Zoom fatigue. All right, we're going to start by talking about how we got to this moment. We know that decades of the government and politicians prioritizing consolidation of wealth and power with the rich have left working class, BIPOC, and frontline communities without the resources needed to weather the multiple crises we are dealing with today. Decades of government inaction and environmental injustice have left the most vulnerable communities bearing the brunt of climate change. We have a broken healthcare system that puts profit over people's lives. We have an elite-driven and ever-increasing wealth gap that reinforces class division and the hogging of the Earth's resources by the few. Systemic racial injustice continues to harm BIPOC communities. We have seen the rise of the Black Lives Matter movement and want to acknowledge the liberatory work that Black organizers have done and continue to do today. We recognize that this rings truer now more than ever as the nation experiences a long overdue racial reckoning and calls for justice in the names of so many stolen lives. In particular, when last month marked 1 year since the brutal murder of George Floyd, and today would have been Breonna Taylor's 28th birthday. And lastly, the COVID-19 pandemic has exposed holes in our social support structures and left avoidable deaths in its wake. Now that we have set the scene, we want to ask all of you to answer these two questions in the chat. First, how are you seeing the impacts of these crises in your life and in your community? And secondly, how do the multiple crises of our time relate to each other? Yeah, thanks, Linnea. Happy birthday, Brianna. Homelessness and gentrification, that's a big one. And in LA, yeah, food, housing, healthcare, just full insecurity. Looming evictions, yeah, we are facing that crisis. Definitely a mental health crisis. Powerful coastal hurricanes and flooding, precisely. Gun violence, another big one. Yesterday was Gun Violence Awareness Day. An entirely traumatized society. I think that pretty much sums it up. Thank you for sharing all of those things. Now we're going to watch a short clip from a video from Ray, a Sunriser who tells his story about growing up in Detroit. He'll talk about how these same crises intersect in his hometown and how our economy is set up to make our environment and us as people disposable for the sake of profit.
My name is Ray Norton, and I'm 18 years old. This is how climate change and pollution has affected me. One of my most distinct memories growing up in Detroit is going south on I-75. Smelling the pollution coming from Marathon and seeing the smoke and the fire on the freeway. I remember trying to hold my breath as long as I could, but eventually you have to breathe in. I've lived in Detroit my whole life. We bounced around a lot when I was a kid. We couldn't always afford to pay rent, and neither could a lot of my friends or family. I know that the planet is on a path towards destruction, and I know that it's caused by the same people who produce the smells and the smoke on the freeway. Poor people, minorities, and young people like me are facing violence and threats in our lives every day from a system that treats us like resources to be extracted.
That was a powerful video. And it was powerful to see people share their personal stories in the chat. What Ray and some of you brought up are the results of the problem that is the root cause of all the crises we see today. And the problem is the belief that it is unacceptable, or rather the belief that it is acceptable for some people to control and harm other people and the earth for their own profit. There are some that believe that government has no role to play in improving people's lives or addressing these crises. But we know that things have to change and that the solution must grow from a different idea, that everyone is inherently worthy of dignity and respect and that no one is expendable. The government belongs to us, and it has a responsibility to fix the crises it has caused and improve people's lives, our lives. The solutions are born out of this new way of thinking, and the solutions are many. Angela is going to walk us through those solutions in the next section.
So we are here today to introduce the Green New Deal as a solution that does grow from this different belief, the belief that everyone is inherently valued. But before we dive in, we'd love to hear from you all about what comes to your mind when you think of the Green New Deal. What does the Green New Deal evoke for you? What do you envision when you think about the Green New Deal? Feel free to drop your ideas and impressions in the chat, and I will read some of them out. All inclusive, I see care. Yes, a chance to just live. Big systemic changes. Yes, thank you for sharing all of these things. Good jobs involving good climate jobs. Thank you so much for sharing all of those things. And there are so many exciting things that we can imagine about a world with the Green New Deal. Let's now watch a clip from a video that captures one vision of that world, narrated by Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez.
The wave began when Democrats took back the House in 2018, and then the Senate and the White House in 2020, and launched the decade of the Green New Deal, a flurry of legislation that kicked off our social and ecological transformation to save the planet. It was the kind of swing for the fence ambition we needed. Finally, we were entertaining solutions on the scale of the crises we faced without leaving anyone behind. That included Medicare for All, the most popular social program in American history. We also introduced the federal jobs guarantee, a public option including dignified living wages for work. Funnily enough, the biggest problem in those early years was a labor shortage. We were building a national smart grid, retrofitting every building in America, putting trains like this one all across the country. We needed more workers. That group of kids from my neighborhood were right in the middle of it all, especially this one girl, Ileana. Her first job out of college was with AmeriCorps Climate, restoring wetlands and bayous in coastal Louisiana. Most of her friends were in her union, including some oil workers in transition. They took apart old pipelines and got to work planting mangroves with the same salary and benefits. Of course, when it came to healing the land, we had huge gaps in our knowledge. Luckily, Indigenous communities offered generational expertise to help guide the way. Ileana got restless, tried her hand as a solar plant engineer for a while, but eventually made her career in raising the next generation as part of the Universal Child Care Initiative. As it turns out, caring for others is valuable, low-carbon work, and we started paying real money to folks like teachers, domestic workers, and home health aides. Those were years of massive change, and not all of it was good. When Hurricane Sheldon hit southern Florida, parts of Miami went underwater for the last time. But as we battled the floods, fires, and droughts, we knew how lucky we were to have started acting when we did. And we didn't just change the infrastructure, we changed how we did things. We became a society that was not only modern and wealthy, but dignified and humane too. By committing to universal rights like healthcare and meaningful work for all, we stopped being so scared of the future. We stopped being scared of each other, and we found our shared purpose. Ileana heard the call too, and in 2028, she ran for office in the first cycle of publicly funded election campaigns. And now she occupies the seat that I once held. I couldn't be more proud of her, a true child of the Green New Deal. When I think back to my first term in Congress, riding that old school Amtrak in 2019, all of this was still ahead of us. And the first big step was just closing our eyes and imagining it. We can be whatever we have the courage to see.
Yeah, this video, this vision always inspires me so much. I'd love to know in the chat, just very briefly in 1 or 2 words, how does this video make you feel? Inspired, definitely hopeful. Me too. Excited. Yeah, lots of excitement. And that's actually, excitement is a big emotion for me about the Green New Deal becoming a reality for all of us. So let's dive in and explore what the Green New Deal really is. And the first thing to know about it is that it is not a bill. It is not a policy proposal or something that could become legislation. Instead, it's a non-binding resolution with a simple goal of defining the problem we're facing and defining the scope of potential solutions. It is a vision document that gives members of Congress the opportunity to express their support or disapproval on topics that they cannot otherwise vote on, which gives the public a preview of how our elected officials might vote on future legislation. To make the vision of the Green New Deal a reality, we need Congress and the president to pass dozens of new laws and policies over the next 10 years. In short, the Green New Deal is a congressional resolution that offers a roadmap for how America can create a carbon-free economy, solve inequalities, and create millions of good jobs, all in the next 10 years. No big deal. The Green New Deal is one of the only plans that has been put forward that is in alignment with scientific consensus. It also focuses on creating the maximum amount of prosperity for working people and marginalized communities in the process. It exists at the intersection of the movements for climate action, racial justice, labor rights, and other areas of social progress. It's also about achieving environmental justice, economic equity, and universal healthcare. So what does that mean? It means that there's no climate justice without social justice. So if you care about clean air and water, then you should also care about protecting Indigenous communities who suffer from a lack of access to clean water, food, and air caused by decades of oppression and neglect by our government. If you care about sustainable businesses, then you should also care about fixing racial and gender wealth imbalances that prevent certain communities from fully participating in our economy and creating a stable life. If you care about renewable energy, then you should also care about ensuring rights and higher standards for workers transitioning into the renewables industry. Everything is interconnected, and we will be touching on that fact throughout the teach-in. On April 20th, Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Senator Ed Markey reintroduced the Green New Deal resolution to Congress with 103 House co-sponsors. This reintroduction addresses critical feedback gathered from frontline communities and other organizations who are central to the vision of the Green New Deal. What's also exciting is that other forward-thinking members of Congress have put forth over a dozen other Green New Deal related bills and resolutions on topics ranging from public housing to new funding for cities to building energy resilient communities. And in the words of Representative Ocasio-Cortez, we're going to transition to a 100% carbon-free economy that is more unionized, more just, more dignified, and guarantees more healthcare and housing than we ever have before. That's our goal. The Green New Deal resolution is just 14 pages long, but it contains 2 big ideas. The first part states what America has to do to solve the impending climate crisis. Basically, we need to completely stop burning fossil fuels. The second part talks about how we'll protect and uplift people during the transition away from fossil fuels and beyond. Our current system is built on inequality and does not provide everyone with the basic means to achieve a good life. Therefore, protecting people is not only about guaranteeing economic security for fossil fuel workers who are already losing their current jobs to the clean energy sector, but protecting people is also about ensuring that all Americans can lead safe and dignified lives. So in order to achieve these five goals, we will need to deploy many strategies across all sectors of society. And just some examples include investing in renewable energy sources, expanding electric vehicles and affordable public transit, building resilience to climate disasters, spurring clean manufacturing, repairing and retrofitting infrastructure, and fostering regenerative farming practices. We'll also need to deploy strategies that will help protect people as we transition away from fossil fuel and towards a sustainable economy. And these strategies include a federal good jobs guarantee, providing affordable education and job training, ensuring environmental justice and indigenous sovereignty, protecting public lands, waters, and oceans, implementing Medicare for all and more public housing, and public banking and adequate civic ownership of projects. All of this will take a lot of work, good, real, meaningful work around which we must mobilize the entire country. So the Green New Deal resolution has 5 overarching goals that cover those 2 parts. Decarbonize every sector to stay under 1.5 degrees Celsius of warming. Create millions of good union jobs through a federal jobs guarantee. Make massive investments in green infrastructure. Secure clean air, water, food, and access to nature for all people, and protect and invest in frontline and vulnerable communities. So keep these 5 goals in mind because we're going to revisit them a bit later when we talk about Biden and the upcoming infrastructure package. So in this section, we learned that the Green New Deal is a visionary congressional resolution, not a bill, that it exists at the intersection of many movements for change, and that it states that the US must do 2 main things. First, decarbonize every sector of its economy and second, protect workers and frontline communities in the process. And now I'm going to hand it off to Celia, who will talk about criticisms of the Green New Deal and how to address them.
Thanks, Angela. So we will need to bring as many people onto the Green New Deal train as possible. And the good news is a majority of voters do say they would support Green New Deal policies, but a few people in power are doing all they can to block that support and stop the Green New Deal from happening. Politicians have spun bogus ideas and fake news to make the Green New Deal sound totally outlandish. So for a little fun, let's get a refresher of some of these talking points that we've all heard far too many times.
This disastrous plan would be a massive government takeover.
It would stifle innovation.
Wasteful and reckless spending.
Rather than setting realistic goals,
we would go from about 94 million cows to 0 cows.
That resolution will not pass the Senate because there's no way to pay for it.
Destructive, socialist, daydream.
The Green New Deal is a long shot. But right now, it's also the only plan that acknowledges what we know is coming.
What is the world that we want? What is the country that we want? And how do we get there? And how do we get there in a way that is just? And how do we get there in a way that stabilizes the climate and heals our planet? Because if we don't do that, then there will be no paradigm because there will be nothing to fight for.
So that was some negative energy, but some of these criticisms and concerns are more valid than others. So we're going to break some of them down and look at how the Green New Deal addresses them. So to start, we'll get our favorite one out of the way, one that some of you were reacting to in the chat, that there will be 0 cows under a Green New Deal. So this one is obviously a little ridiculous, but we can actually respond in a constructive way. Factory farming creates huge methane outputs, but cattle can be integrated and part of a regenerative farming system that actively reduces emissions. Next, on a less ridiculous note, some may be concerned that the Green New Deal will take away oil, gas, and coal jobs. But actually, the Green New Deal is rooted in a just transition for fossil fuel workers. As the climate crisis and economic inequalities worsen, communities will continue to be left behind. There's been a 50% decline in coal jobs since 2011, and the United Mine Workers of America recently backed a shift from coal to renewable energy, as long as the plan included job protections. The market is already moving away from fossil fuel jobs, but the Green New Deal is the only plan to actually transition these workers into new, cleaner industries, making sure they don't get left behind. We hear this next one pretty often as well, that the Green New Deal includes a bunch of socialist policies that have nothing to do with climate change. But in reality, the Green New Deal is about more than climate change. It's rooted in a rights-based framework, which believes that every person is entitled to basic human rights of clean air and water, housing, healthcare, and a good job. Now, the biggest and most persistent attack against the Green New Deal is the cost. And this is the trillion-dollar criticism, that the Green New Deal will cost too much and that our children and grandchildren will be stuck with the bill. So now we'd love to hear from you. Drop your ideas about how the Green Deal addresses this criticism in the chat, and I'll read some of them out. Cost of inaction is far greater. It'll pay for itself many times over. We could just take from our bloated military budget. Yep, saving energy saves energy costs. Money is a social construct. Love that one. Yeah, these are all amazing responses. So there are a lot of different ways to tackle this criticism, but one of the biggest ones is something a lot of you said, that it costs way more to continue burning fossil fuels. Each day that we continue business as usual, we face worsening climate disasters, economic collapse, and biodiversity loss, which all have environmental, social, and economic costs. The Green New Deal will not only prevent us from paying for the climate crisis down the line, but it will actually create economic prosperity by investing in the clean economy of the future. So, will it cost too much? No. In fact, the correct way to budget for the Green New Deal is the same way we paid for World War II. It's not a question of where we get the money to pay for it. We already have the money. It's really a question of what our moral priorities are. So hopefully that exercise helped us practice talking about the Green New Deal to people who are opposed to it. We think that these 3 things are important to keep in mind as you continue to engage with people who criticize the Green New Deal. First, a good economist should be thinking long-term. And the Green New Deal is actually the biggest economic opportunity we have. Second, long-term thinking about what will foster freedom, care, and happiness will lead us to prosperity. And third, investing now in our future will save billions of dollars in disaster relief and empower communities. So now I'm going to pass it off to Jacob, who's going to talk about the moment we're in.
Thank you, Celia, and thank you everyone for being here with us today. We're going to go through this one section here and then we'll take a 5-minute break. But right now we're going to talk about the political moment we're in. This section has a lot going on in it, so I'm going to ask that everyone stays with me and I'll do my best to break it all down. With Biden in office, it's now our job to continue pushing his administration to address the many crises we face, including climate change. Now we need to understand the shortcomings of Biden's American Jobs Plan, so we know where we need to push and where we need to direct our people power. I know stuff can get confusing with so many names and bills and different acronyms, So we're going to break down some recent developments in legislation that we need to be focused on. On March 31st, 2021, Biden announced the American Jobs Plan, also commonly referred to in the media as the infrastructure package. It's a huge priority for his administration and Democrats this year, and it currently aims to invest $2 to $3 trillion over 8 years. It's important to note that the American Jobs Plan is just Biden's proposal for an infrastructure package, and it will be negotiated on and deliberated on by members of Congress. And if it's passed, it would be signed into law likely in August or September. So when you hear the words American Jobs Plan or infrastructure package, they are the same thing. So what's in Biden's infrastructure proposal? Biden's plan would invest $2.7 trillion over 8 years. This would be the largest federal investment in solving social and economic crises in 50 years. But it's nowhere near enough to meaningfully combat the climate crisis or transform our society and economy. To really do those things, we need at least $10 trillion in federal spending over the next decade, or $1 trillion per year. And we need to start making those investments as soon as possible. So how does Biden's infrastructure proposal stack up against the Green New Deal goals? Well, the Green New Deal calls for decarbonizing all sectors of our economy so that the Earth's average temperature stays below 1.5 degrees Celsius of warming. But Biden's plan focuses on renewable energy and electric vehicles, leaving out many emission-heavy sectors of our economy like transportation and manufacturing. The Green New Deal creates millions of good jobs and guarantees a living wage. And while Biden's plan would create thousands of good union jobs, along with investments in the care economy, Biden makes no mention of a guaranteed living wage. We are calling for massive investments in green infrastructure, and Biden has heeded that call by proposing investments to upgrade our electrical grid and transportation systems. We know that clean air, food, and water for all is needed to build community resilience, but Biden's plan only guarantees clean water. Lastly, we know that to address inequality, there must be investment in frontline communities, and Biden's infrastructure proposal directs 40% of investments to disadvantaged communities and creates a $16 billion program intended to help fossil fuel workers transition into new jobs. As we can see here, Biden's infrastructure proposal is a good step, but it's simply not enough. Let's see how the proposal scores on the rest of the Green New Deal. Biden's infrastructure proposal only upgrades 2 million out of around 140 million housing units across the country. This meets Biden's campaign promise of 1.7 million sustainable homes, but it's far short of the vision of the Green New Deal. Biden downsized his research and development budget from the campaign promise of $300 billion to only $180 billion, and much of this money would go to fossil fuel companies and big agriculture. Biden's plan invests significantly less money into transportation compared to bills introduced by Senator Schumer, Warren, and Markey, which propose moving to 100% electrified and sustainable public transit and electric vehicles. Lastly, Biden's plan falls short on job creation. His version of the Civilian Climate Corps would create 200,000 jobs, but we know the government is capable of much more, and we need millions of good jobs to fight climate change. So overall, Biden's infrastructure proposal isn't doing too great. With Democrats in control of Congress and the White House, we do have the opportunity to push for the transformative legislation that we need, but it may not come as a shock to many of you. It turns out Congress and our government is very dysfunctional. In an attempt to circumvent this dysfunction, the Democrats in Congress are using a process called budget reconciliation, where they can include many pieces of legislation into one big bill that is voted on as a single package instead of passing each bill individually. This is important for us to understand. The Democrats can use the budget reconciliation process to pass the infrastructure package. Most of the pieces of legislation we are excited about won't pass on their own. So our number one priority isn't getting every member of Congress signed on to every single bill. Our priority is really bigger than that. Our movement's job over the next few months is to ensure the most ambitious, most just version of the infrastructure package is put forward and signed into law. Unfortunately, Biden is trying to negotiate on the package with GOP leaders, which is resulting in the size of the plan getting smaller. Yet, at the same time, economists at UMass Amherst say that a $9.5 trillion investment over 10 years would create 15.5 million good green jobs per year and is needed to address the scale of the climate crisis we face today. Our movement must continue to hold firm, communicating loud and clear about what is a moral and just investment for our futures in this critical moment. We must not be disheartened by the lack of action from politicians and must make our voices heard in demanding the infrastructure package that we need. Luckily, there are a lot of great pieces of legislation that would help us move towards the vision of a Green New Deal, such as the PRO Act, which would usher in a wave of worker organizing and be a massive win for the labor movement. The Thrive Act, which calls for a green and just recovery, and the Green New Deal for public housing, which would invest billions to improve health, safety, and comfort in our federal public housing. Then there's the Energy Resilient Communities Act, which puts low-income communities at the front of the line for clean energy grants and prioritizes energy equity. Or the National Climate Emergency Act, which calls on the president to declare a national climate emergency. There's also HR 1, which would help create a more equitable democracy by expanding voting rights, and so many more. Not all of these can be part of the infrastructure package, but many components of them can. Our goal is to get as many Green New Deal aligned policies as we can into the final infrastructure package. For Sunrise, the Green New Deal for Public Housing Bill, the Green New Deal for Cities and States Bill, and the Civilian Climate Corps are all very aligned with our movement's work. Let's briefly talk about each one now and what these bills mean for our future actions in the months to come. The Green New Deal for Cities proposes for federal government to distribute $1 trillion in direct funding to cities, towns, and tribes over 4 years, allowing local governments to enact ambitious climate resilience projects and environmental justice initiatives. The policy would create hundreds of thousands of good union jobs and fund reparations programs to remediate historical environmental injustices. While this bill is not within the scope of consideration for the infrastructure package, it does capture the longer-term vision that our movement holds for how we need to fund both small and large-scale projects over time to transform every aspect of our society. The Green New Deal for public housing would increase affordable housing, decarbonize public housing, and eliminate public housing environmental hazards, all while creating nearly 250,000 good-paying jobs. The infrastructure package currently includes $40 billion for addressing housing infrastructure, which is the estimated cost to repair New York's critical housing infrastructure by itself. But the Green New Deal for public housing proposes $172 billion over the next 10 years to revitalize public housing across the nation. While this bill has growing support, it's not in a position to be considered within the infrastructure package. Nonetheless, the Sunrise Movement looks to continue supporting the Green New Deal for public housing because it's really a win-win-win for everybody. For one, it's estimated to create 200,000 jobs per year. Second, the policy would result in enormous savings for the nearly 2 million individuals living in public housing. It will also reduce public housing water bills by up to 30% per year and energy bills by up to 70%. And third, given that buildings are responsible for nearly 40% of total domestic energy consumption, this bill would significantly help us reduce our overall carbon emissions. In summary, revitalizing public housing would have a huge impact on people's pocketbooks and their quality of life, while ensuring our homes are resilient and climate friendly. And last but not least, the Civilian Climate Corps is a visionary policy that would create a government jobs program, putting a new generation of Americans to work combating the climate crisis. Back in January, the CCC was established as part of Biden's executive orders on climate, but had no funding to make it a reality. The infrastructure package currently asks for $10 billion over 10 years to fund the program, but this is nowhere near enough and would only create about 20,000 jobs. In April, Senator Markey, along with AOC, rolled out a proposal for a much more robust and just CCC. Their proposal would invest $130 billion, which is 13 times bigger than what Biden proposed, and would create 1.5 million new jobs over the next 5 years that are non-extractive, equitable, good jobs. If this bill is passed into law, it would signify the beginning of the decade of the Green New Deal and will open the door for better, bigger employment programs down the road. That's why our movement's job is to make sure the most ambitious version of a CCC that's rooted in justice makes it into the final infrastructure package and gets signed into law. We are confident that the CCC will be included in the infrastructure package in some form or another. In fact, there are 7 CCC proposals in Congress already, so we know there is momentum in political support. Markey's version of the bill is the best of these proposals and is also one of the top 5 Progressive Caucus priorities. So here's the crux of the matter. Will the CCC create thousands of jobs, or will it create millions of jobs that meet the scale of the climate crisis? Will these be good jobs that pay a $15 minimum wage and provide healthcare, or will these jobs be only accessible to the privileged few? Will the majority of people hired through the CCC come from communities at the front line of the climate crisis and be employed in jobs directly serving and benefiting their own communities? Or will it only offer opportunity to white upper-class college graduates? Will it narrow climate jobs to conservation? Or will it employ people to build community gardens, improve public transportation, and support emergency response from climate disasters? Folks, it's now our job to make our demand for the big and bold CCC loud and clear for the nation to hear. So in this section, we learned a lot about the moment we're in, but to summarize, Biden's infrastructure plan should be celebrated as a win for the movement, even though it's not nearly enough to meet the urgency of the crises we face. We have a shot at launching the decade of the Green New Deal with the upcoming $2.7 trillion infrastructure package, and our actions over the next few months will be crucial to building the momentum we need to get the best and most equitable version of it passed in Congress. There are lots of amazing pieces of progressive Green New Deal legislation that we support, and our biggest priority will be getting the most transformative version of the Civilian Climate Corps included in the infrastructure package in order to achieve our goal of good jobs for all. So, can we win the big Green New Deal legislation like the CCC and all these other bills? In short, yes. But after a 5-minute break, we will learn more about the power we need to win with Celia. So we're going to play some music and we'll see everybody in about 5 minutes.
We are coming back. I hope everyone had a good break and is ready to keep learning with us. So want to welcome everyone back into the space and get us thinking about our power. By now, we understand the crises that the Green New Deal will address and why a solution this big is needed to avert climate catastrophe and address decades of racial and economic inequality. Luckily, America has overcome similar challenges in the past. So now let's take a look at the New Deal, the historical precedent for the Green New Deal, how our current political structure is failing to meet the crisis, and also learn how we can build the people and political power we need to win Green New Deal policies. So we are not reinventing the wheel here. America has mobilized at mass scale before. The Green New Deal is modeled after President Franklin Delano Roosevelt's New Deal, a series of executive orders and laws passed in the 1930s to revive America during a time of social upheaval in the wake of the Great Depression. Programs that we take for granted today, like Social Security, unemployment benefits, and the 40-hour work week, as well as many environmental and financial protections, were created during this short period of time. Through New Deal programs, the government put millions of people to work, transforming our infrastructure, conserving land and forests, and even creating inspiring public art, like the mural seen on the left. In fact, so many jobs were created that the federal government became the largest employer in the nation. When we faced the threat of fascism during World War II, the federal government mobilized the American economy and workforce. The New Deal was ambitious enough to even publicly advertise recruitment for its programs directly to the American people. It was an all hands on deck approach to mobilization. However, the New Deal left many people behind. The jobs mostly went to white men and further increased racial, gender, and economic disparities. We need the same kind of mobilization across the country and throughout all sectors of society for the Green New Deal and policies like a civilian climate corps. We need to enlist millions of people into the meaningful work of securing our future. But this time, we have the opportunity to mobilize in order to benefit everyone, not just middle-class white men. So how do we make that kind of society-wide mobilization happen? Well, President Biden can meet this moment, and he can play a huge role in advancing Green New Deal policies. He can take inspiration from the New Deal and learn from FDR's mistakes. So we need this mobilization across the country and throughout all sectors of society for policies like, the Civilian Climate Corps we talked about earlier was actually inspired by the Civilian Conservation Corps, which was a program, one of FDR's signature New Deal programs during the Great Depression. This program pulled millions of men out of unemployment and improved our nation's infrastructure. But the Civilian Conservation Corps was also deeply oppressive. It had exclusionary, racist, and sexist practices of hiring almost only white men and continued America's legacy of non-consensual development on stolen Indigenous land. That's why, to succeed this time around, the modern Civilian Climate Corps must be deeply rooted in equity, Indigenous sovereignty, and be brave enough to face the scale of the climate crisis, and prioritize giving good jobs to communities who have been disproportionately harmed by systemic racism and our broken economy. Nonetheless, we can also learn from the society-wide mobilization that was achieved way back then. Let's watch this video and see what this looked like.
To understand what that might look like, we have to go back to March 4th, 1933.
Overcast and sullen, shadowed by uncertainty in Washington and throughout the land.
FDR entered his first term at the height of the Great Depression, while environmental disaster was ravaging the southern plains and fascism was on the rise. A new era of politics was about to be born.
The only thing we have to fear is fear itself.
Like Biden, FDR was elected and pushed into action by popular movements demanding change in a time of crisis. He met the moment by mobilizing every government power at his disposal to help working Americans. He established the Civilian Conservation Corps, which employed hundreds of thousands of young men to plant billions of trees and build the state and national parks that we enjoy today. The Works Progress Administration put millions of unemployed Americans to work, building the nation's infrastructure. As New Deal programs took effect, a newly empowered labor movement organized with progressive politicians to place laws on FDR's desk, like the National Labor Relations Act, which provided a path for millions of workers to join unions and collectively bargain with their employers. And while much of the New Deal was done in coordination with Congress, FDR exercised a level of executive power never before seen in the US, and never seen since. His work included a record-shattering 3,728 executive orders. When the U.S. joined World War II, FDR created the Office of War Mobilization to coordinate an unprecedented surge in wartime production.
It would assure we have the right numbers of workers in the right places at the right time.
So the Green New Deal requires coordinated national action to transform every aspect of our society over an extended period of time. And only the federal government can achieve that. But this massive government action isn't part of our political common sense. Our political common sense, our collective understanding of what is possible and what the government's role is, changed with FDR and the New Deal. FDR brought populist ideas like the right to a job and healthcare and an education to the forefront of American politics and government action. During the New Deal, the American people understood that the government must play an essential role in regulating corporations, creating ladders of upward mobility, and ensuring that economic winners, the wealthy, pay their fair share. Our political common sense changed again with Ronald Reagan in the 80s, who railed against big government spending, welfare queens, and claimed to represent the silent majority of Americans. Reagan made the populist ideas of FDR toxic in Washington, pushing Democrats further to the right in an attempt to appeal to white voters. As he famously even said, the 9 most terrifying words in the English language are, "I'm from the government and I'm here to help." Sadly, these effects are still felt today. For example, broadly popular common sense policies like a $15 minimum wage sound preposterous to many Democrats in Congress who are fearful of rocking the boat. But it wasn't just Reagan that changed our political common sense. It was also massive amounts of money from corporations being poured into our political system and the media. CEOs of fossil fuel companies and other big corporations have been bankrolling our politicians, buying influence to move them away from supporting a government that protects and values every American. They have used divide and conquer strategies across race and class lines to weaken the will of the people, not to mention to instill doubt and denial around climate change. This has been a decades-long strategy to protect their profits and block progress every step of the way. They do this because our current economy needs our environment and people to be disposable. Their divide and conquer strategy has 3 phases. 1, deceive the people. 2, buy out politicians. And 3, consolidate power in government. Our current political common sense allows these corporations and billionaire CEOs to corrupt our government. And it's caused many of us to feel discouraged, powerless, and unable to make change. So when we hear politicians or even our friends, family, and coworkers say things like, "That's pie in the sky thinking," or "that will never get done," it's a manifestation of our political common sense. As organizers, we have to acknowledge that our vision for a better future is in tension with the current common sense, but that doesn't mean it's not possible. Our work is twofold: to advocate for the boldest policies and elect the most courageous representatives, and to shift the public narrative about who we are and what we stand for as a country. When we talk to people in our communities about the Green New Deal, we also have to understand another challenge called tactical framing, which is a product of the current political common sense. If you've ever seen the Green New Deal discussed on the news, you've probably noticed that most of the conversation revolves around whether the Green New Deal will help or hurt Democrats, or that it'll cost too much, rather than the actual substance of the Green New Deal. For more on this, we're going to check out a clip from this video. Give us 1 minute. Video should be coming up right now.
This Sunday, the Democratic divide. Some progressives are pushing hard for a Green New Deal, but other Democrats worry they're being impractical.
Is there a risk the Democrats maybe overplay their hand, rile up the Republican base, and you say, look, socialism, and some of these unrealistic ideas?
Tactical framing sounds like when you crop your problem areas out of a Tinder photo. Or a video. But it's actually an approach to news coverage that focuses on strategy over substance. So instead of asking, is this new policy proposal a good idea? Tactical framing asks, is it popular? Can it pass? How will it play in the next election?
The discussion is focused on the players and the implications for them and their political careers, not the policy or its capacity to solve a problem.
Kathleen Hall Jamieson coined the phrase tactical framing, and she argues that this obsession with strategy is making it hard for us to understand big policy ideas.
Ask yourself how much of the coverage of the Green New Deal has told you what specifically is in it.
Other Republicans said the plan sounded more like communist economic doctrine.
You probably have no idea what the Green New Deal is. You probably have some sense that it has to do with climate change, but you probably don't know much beyond that.
It is hard to argue with her. Look at some of the headlines from the Green New Deal debate. Is the Green New Deal smart politics for Democrats? Green New Deal divides Democrats on climate change. 7 reasons Democrats won't pass a Green New Deal. We're talking about the fate of the human race here, but the focus is still on the politics.
Could the fight over this plan divide the Democratic Party?
Well, Republicans succeeded painting it as an unrealistic boondoggle.
Notice when you're saying that, you're not asking, well, what is the problem they're trying to address? Is this a viable solution?
So after watching that clip, you might be feeling a bit like, WTF? Tactical framing certainly helps explain a lot. So if we can't rely on changing the way the press talks about policy to help us, then what can we do? Well, we can organize. Just a few years ago, climate change wasn't even considered a top political issue. But in the 2020 Democratic presidential primary, we had politicians one-upping each other to have the most bold, progressive climate plan. That wasn't random. It was because of persistent and courageous organizing by the Sunrise Movement and other groups. And this organizing paid off. We beat Trump in 2020 and pushed Biden during his campaign to get a lot more serious about the climate crisis. In his first days in office, we got a number of wins because of the people power we have, because we have organized, demonstrated, and made our voices heard. These include no new oil or gas leases on federal lands, establishing the White House Office of Domestic Climate Policy, and establishing the Civilian Climate Corps to put people to work restoring our ecosystems. But remember, we're still fighting to make sure we get the biggest, boldest version of the CCC passed. Biden also halted construction of the Keystone XL pipeline, committed that 40% of green investments will go to frontline communities, and appointed Deb Haaland as Secretary of the Interior, making her the first Indigenous person to serve in a cabinet position. For one, a priority for Haaland and President Biden is to ensure that free, prior, and informed consent of new development on tribal lands. These are great wins, and we should celebrate them. And these executive orders will start to shift our economy away from fossil fuels and towards a just carbon-free economy, but we know that they aren't enough. We need bold legislation to transform our society so that it works for everyone. And that's going to take us uniting across our movements to fight for the change we need. So let's go back to that idea of political common sense. On the political left, there is a new common sense emerging, and it's supported by something we call the People's Alignment. We can think of the People's Alignment as a broad coalition of movements that believes in solidarity, dignity, and justice for all people, and uses strong government action to protect the common good. These movements are not new. Most have existed for a long time, but this broader coalition is newer and growing in strength. The People's Alignment could change our understanding of what is possible for our government to accomplish. So I invite you to put a plus in the chat if you or someone you know is part of one of these groups or movements. I'm sure a lot of us know someone who's, a teacher or part of, one of these movements or works in one of these industries. So we have a lot of commonality here. By mobilizing within and across our communities, we will build the collective power needed for our political common sense to change. It's about people power. But what exactly does this collective people power look like? How many people are we talking about here? It turns out it only takes 3.5% of a population to commit to nonviolent action and civil disobedience to change our government. Dr. Erica Chenoweth is a researcher who studied 234 campaigns from across the world from 1900 to 2006 and found that out of 100 nonviolent campaigns, the ones that succeeded mobilized at least 3.5% of the population, and many succeeded with much less. It's also worth noting that many of these movements aim to overthrow violent regimes, which is much more than we're trying to accomplish. These were grassroots campaigns that succeeded because people organized with their neighbors and friends, and we can do the same thing to win a Green New Deal. So, can we win big Green New Deal legislation like a civilian climate corps? Yes, but it will take all the people and political power that we can muster to achieve it. Remember, 3.5% or less. So our key takeaways for this section are that we've already moved Biden on climate, and now we need to make sure that he embraces his FDR moment. We need to shift our country's political common sense in order for the government to mobilize at the scale of the crisis. And research shows that if we attain the active participation of 3.5% or less of the population, we can win. So now we're going to hear from Angela about climate solutions and good jobs.
Thank you, Celia. So in this section, we want to talk a bit about what we mean when we say good jobs and why we'll need so many of them. But first, we wanted to ask you this. How anxious are you about climate change from a scale of 1 to 10, with 1 being not anxious at all and 10 being very anxious? Yeah, I'm seeing a lot of 10s, 100s, 40s. Yeah, the climate anxiety is through the roof. Yeah, 8s, 11s. Thank you for sharing, everyone. I do feel the weight of that anxiety. And as young people, especially, we often carry a lot of climate anxiety and grief. And it's important to acknowledge these feelings and treat them with care. It's also important to transform these feelings into action. We're all here today because we're deeply concerned about the climate crisis, and we're ready to throw down to create a society that puts people over profits and prioritizes just and effective climate solutions. Before we talk about how a good jobs guarantee is a crucial part of those solutions, we have to start at the beginning with the American energy economy and how we might transform it. So let's dive into it with this video.
A few years ago, Saul decided to make a model of America's energy use. He ended up reading basically every available piece of data from
the Energy Information Administration, Department of Transportation, National Highway Transit Authority, the Census Bureau, Bureau of Labor Statistics, and NOAA. And so we pull all of those together to build a very comprehensive picture of the U.S. energy economy.
That picture of the U.S. energy economy, it looks like this.
If you're just looking at the whole thing at once, it just looks like a big pile of spaghetti. It's hard to make sense of, but it just traces energy, every unit of energy. How does it enter the economy? How is it used throughout the economy?
This kind of chart is called a Sankey diagram, and it's easier to understand in 3 sections. These columns here on the left are the sources of all the energy used in the US, like natural gas, coal, solar, wind, nuclear, and oil. This column in the middle is what those energy sources get converted into. So a lot of it becomes electricity. Most oil becomes the fuel we use for transportation. And here you can see how much natural gas energy is being used to generate electricity versus being used directly to power things like cooking stoves. And over here on the right, this is where all the energy is used. broken down into incredible detail, like how much energy is being used to light shopping malls in the US, or how much energy is being used by vehicles driven for work.
So you start to get this incredibly detailed picture of all of the interconnections, which is really, really important when you do the next exercise. But what happens if we decarbonize?
Remember that carbon emissions come from the burning of fossil fuels, this stuff. And Saul says that means that to decarbonize, we just need to follow their path. The first place that leads you is here, with electricity and the energy we use to generate it, the majority of which in the US comes from two kinds of fossil fuel, natural gas and coal. If the US wants to decarbonize, it needs to stop getting electricity this way, and to replace it with other decarbonized energy sources. That means coal power plants, gone. Gas power plants, gone. All electricity would come from renewable sources: wind, solar, geothermal, hydroelectric and biomass, or nuclear energy. Decarbonizing the way we get electricity would be a huge investment, but it would also only eliminate 20% of emissions. And that's because electricity and energy are not exactly the same thing.
That doesn't solve the vehicle's emissions. It doesn't solve your heating emissions from using natural gas or fuel oil in your basement.
All these other parts of the economy draw their energy directly from fossil fuels. Like transportation, we use oil for fuel. And commercial and residential buildings, where we use gas and oil for heat. But Saul says there's a kind of elegant solution to this. You decarbonize these sectors by switching their energy source from here to here. Make all of it electric. Because we already have almost all the technology we need to do it.
Heat pumps, batteries, electric vehicles, wind turbines, nuclear power plants, yes, we know that can work. We know we can do electric cars. We know we can do electric heat for nearly everything.
It's all, in the end, just about machines, right? We got a bunch of machines that use fossil fuel energy. We need to replace them with machines that use clean electricity. And so it really just comes down to a matter of industrial capacity. How fast can you build machines?
That really helps to put our energy system into perspective. Yeah, drop a word or two in the chat of how it made you feel. I already saw a lot of love in the chat for it. Yeah, informed. It's very informative, interesting. So for me, this video really helped me realize how important clean electrification is going to be in the coming decade, and that we already know how to do it. We already have the technological capacities to do it. But this is only one of many, many solutions that we already have at our fingertips. So let's take a brief look at some of the top 80 solutions identified by Project Drawdown as the most effective at reducing greenhouse gases. Some of these solutions reduce our greenhouse gas emissions, like onshore wind turbines. Other solutions aim to support natural systems that absorb extra greenhouse gases already present in our atmosphere, like stewarding tropical forests. Lots of these solutions rely on technology, but plenty of solutions are rooted in social change, like educating girls and family planning. Every solution matters, whether we're retrofitting buildings to be more energy efficient, practicing regenerative agriculture, or building onshore wind turbines. Because at the end of the day, it's not simply about reducing the amount of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, it's also about building a better society where everyone can be thriving. And that's what we love about this kaleidoscope of solutions. They can be implemented by lots of different people all over the world and also have many benefits beyond carbon reduction. Benefits like protecting biodiversity of vulnerable ecosystems, empowering marginalized communities, and diversifying rural economies. And as we scale up these solutions, it's important that we partner with local communities to make sure that they also share in these benefits. And guess what? All of these solutions create a ton of opportunities to put people to work with good, clean jobs. But that's still not the end of it. One of the most important benefits of transitioning to a lower carbon economy is that we'll be able to take better care of each other. Teaching, nursing, child and elder care, domestic and agricultural work, these care jobs are good, clean jobs too. Care work is about making sure people have the support they need to be healthy, to grow and learn and thrive. And care work makes up some of the lowest carbon parts of our economy, the very parts we need to expand. But the people who do so much of this work are already often women of color and migrants who are often exploited and underpaid in today's economy. So we need to invest in care workers and make sure that they're included in a just transition for all. So now I'm going to hand it over to Jacob, who will touch on what a just transition looks like in the next section.
Thanks, Angela. So what is a just transition anyways? A just transition is direct investment in the working class and communities of color that have borne the brunt of the harm caused by climate change. A just transition is centered in Indigenous sovereignty and support for our Indigenous communities. And a just transition must support those most affected by the transition away from fossil fuels, like those who currently work in the fossil fuel industry. It's important also to note that the framework of a just transition was developed by labor unions and environmental justice groups, and we are grateful to those who have been in this movement before us and allow us to stand on their shoulders. What's more, to ensure that the just transition is fully realized, we also have to make sure that marginalized communities have a meaningful say in how the Green New Deal is designed and implemented. We would be remiss to not directly discuss environmental racism when talking about what it means to have a just transition from our current fossil fuel powered economy. The video on the next slide features Josiah, who you met earlier today, talking about the impacts of environmental racism on his life and his community.
Growing up in Carson, a city in Los Angeles County, as a Black kid with childhood asthma, my parents were always worried about my ability to just breathe. I couldn't participate in gym class like normal kids, so I always had to have my inhaler on me. And to make matters worse, my middle school was less than a few miles away from one of the biggest refineries west of the Mississippi. In LA County, over 500,000 people live within a half-mile of an active oil well, which spews dangerous chemicals like benzene into the air. And of the 1.8 million Californians most impacted by environmental pollution, 92% are people of color. Living near oil production is deadly, increasing the risk of asthma, nosebleeds, respiratory issues, high-risk pregnancies, and cancer. Neighborhood drilling is one of the most visible forms of environmental racism. So what are California's elected officials doing about it? It turns out Hollywood didn't build Los Angeles. The oil industry did. It began in the 1890s, and by the 1930s, California was producing a quarter of the world's oil. Starting around then, real estate developers used decades of redlining to force generations of Black and brown communities to live in the toxic backyard of the fossil fuel industry. And from the very beginning, oil companies knew they were poisoning people. In 1943, an internal Shell oil document marked confidential warned of harmful toxins linked to oil production, stating any exposure at all is dangerous. With about 5,000 active oil wells, Los Angeles County is the largest urban oil field in the U.S. And right next door to where I grew up is the neighborhood of Wilmington, which is 90% Latinx and surrounded by 6 oil refineries. Through years of hard work and organizing, we've been fighting back against environmental racism. Last year, Assemblymember Al Marasucci introduced Assembly Bill 345, which would have established buffer zones of 2,500 feet between oil and gas drilling sites and sensitive areas like schools, hospitals, and homes. But in August, state senators rejected AB 345 in a 5-4 vote. 3 Democrats, Ana Caballero, Ben Hueso, and Bob Hertzberg, rejected the bill, continuing a long line of racist policymaking, taking money from big oil and standing against Californians. Hertzberg alone has taken tens of thousands of dollars from the fossil fuel industry. California prides itself on being an environmental leader, so why is it still legal to drill for oil next to our schools, our hospitals, our homes? You know, when your entire family has asthma, you, your brother, your father, when you find out that those flare-ups aren't just because of the DNA in your blood, it makes you upset, and it completely alters your way of thinking. There was a purposeful connection between where you live and where fossil fuel industries decide to do business. I want you to be angry at your elected officials. I want you to let them know that they can't continue to get away with this. Just because it is individually affecting me or a larger community of Black and brown people doesn't mean that it's never going to get to you.
Wow, what a powerful video. I get chills every time I watch it from the images of LA and Josiah's amazing voice. Can we get some resonance in the chat and just one word about how that video made you feel? Awesome. Angry. Totally agree, David. Heartbroken. Disappointed. Sad. I'm feeling all those things. All of those are really valid. Yeah, didn't fully shock you. Yep, totally understand that. So I appreciate everyone sharing. I think contextualizing the just transition also requires that we talk about our communities and the uneven impacts of climate change and economic insecurity that have created the environmental racism that Josiah so eloquently describes in that video. Another community that must be centered in a just transition is the many indigenous tribes and people whose stolen land we currently live on. Indigenous people have continued to be on the front lines of defending the land, water, and air we breathe. And we know that traditional ecological knowledge is critical to monitoring and combating climate change. A just transition must recognize Indigenous sovereignty and include reparations for Indigenous communities. Additionally, we have to acknowledge that Indigenous organizers are putting their bodies on the line to protect the environment and disrupt the fossil fuel industry, like the ongoing protest happening right now against the major pipeline project Line 3. As an environmental justice movement, we must support these organizers and center these communities in the work that we do. A third group we must center in the just transition is, of course, fossil fuel industry workers who will need to transition to new jobs in order for our economy to decarbonize. Unions will be a key ally, ensuring that fossil fuel workers are guaranteed wages and benefits and are provided retraining, as well as helping to develop the new jobs that will be central to our new economy. As we've already discussed, the Green New Deal would create millions of good-paying union jobs. But what about those jobs in fossil fuels that are lost? It's true that many jobs in the energy sector paid middle-class wages, but why were there good jobs in the first place? This is largely because workers in industries such as coal organized to win safety protections, healthcare, pensions, and family-sustaining wages. In other words, many jobs in the extractive economy are lucrative because of unionization. The first half of the 20th century saw workers joining unions on a mass scale, building the middle class as we know it. It remains true to this day that union members, on average, earn more and enjoy greater protections on the job. Recognizing the threat to their control, corporations and governments have waged a decades-long attack on workers. As unionization has declined in this country, so has prosperity. Bolstering union membership will be critical for ensuring a just transition for fossil fuel workers and more broadly transforming our economy for the better. The just transition and support from unions needs to be a community-based transition that would move us towards energy democracy. As Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez said when she reintroduced the Green New Deal resolution in April, we refuse to go from an economy of oil barons to solar barons. We can imagine a world free of fossil fuels and powered by publicly owned renewable energy because that world is not too far away from where we are now. Not only is this world possible, but did you know that we have historical examples of large-scale changes to our power infrastructure from not too long ago? During the New Deal era, we electrified much of America for the first time. Private utilities and the market had not delivered accessible electricity across all parts of America because their profit motives didn't align with providing power to all people. So the people figured out how to do it themselves. Private utilities and corporations resisted the Rural Electrification Administration, which created and funded hundreds of local electricity cooperatives around the country. These local co-ops still exist, and together they supply power to half of America's land area. They are a living example of how the people can control our power grid. It's all about people power. So we've talked about the importance of the Civilian Climate Corps in kicking off the decade of the Green New Deal, but it's just the beginning. We can and should think bigger. Popularized in FDR's Economic Bill of Rights and championed by civil rights leaders including Martin Luther King Jr. and Coretta Scott King, a federal jobs guarantee would end involuntary unemployment, promising economic security to all who want it. Such a policy would put millions to work, fixing our nation's most immediate needs, such as caring for our elders or restoring wetlands. In contrast to our current system that relegates working people to live in poverty, a jobs guarantee would provide a fair labor market floor, an incentive for employers to raise standards, and market stabilization during economic downturns. Where the New Deal fell short and perpetuated racial injustice, a jobs guarantee will be community-driven and address deep inequities felt by marginalized communities. Representative Ayanna Pressley recently introduced a federal jobs guarantee bill to bring this idea back into the public narrative. Passing a big, bold CCC, which is a climate-specific federal jobs program, could set an important precedent for future federal jobs guarantees that are more expansive in the future. To achieve all this, we have to transition from thinking in the framework of the social safety net brought on by the New Deal and into a new era that includes a rights-based framework. As it stands today, the American social safety net is a last resort and a flawed one at that. As millions lost their jobs during COVID-19, many Americans fell into food, housing, and healthcare insecurity. We must imagine an economy and a society that provides for everyone regardless of employment status, especially during a crisis. We won't know the stats for some time, but potentially millions lost their health insurance under a system which is tied to employment rather than one that sees health as a right. Instead of the flawed healthcare system we have, the failures of which we're experiencing today, the Green New Deal calls for universal affordable coverage regardless of employment. Instead of allowing thousands and thousands of people to suffer through homelessness, we need to think of housing as a guaranteed right in one of the world's richest countries in the history of the world. And we need to reverse the course we're on of divesting from equitable and accessible public transit and create the infrastructure needed to give equal access to transit to marginalized communities. Rather than a system designed to catch some of you when you fall, we need to shift to an approach with a baseline foundation of guaranteed rights. So this was a long and important section, but the key takeaways that we want to emphasize is that climate solutions and a just transition must center frontline and vulnerable communities as active forces in shaping the Green New Deal and create good jobs for all, empower fossil fuel workers and invest in good paying union jobs in all sectors through a federal jobs guarantee, and reimagine privileges like housing and healthcare as guaranteed rights that all humans innately deserve. We know that we can't get complacent and assume the politicians will deliver these things to us. So now we're going to focus on some ways for you to take action to build the people power that we need to win. So Josiah, take it away.
Hey again, everybody. All right. It's the moment you've all been waiting for. It's the reason we came to this space to be in community with one another. It's time to talk about how we are going to win good jobs for all. Let's start off by reviewing what the Good Jobs for All campaign has been up to and where it's headed. Our movement has spent the past 4 years building up to this moment, a moment where we can actually pass something into law that will signify the first step of the Green New Deal. This is our movement's once-in-a-generation shot to make sure a civilian climate corps that employs 1.5 million people, fights climate change, and transforms our society is passed into law. This fight, the fight about what the CCC looks like, will be a fight about scale, scope, and justice. How many people get jobs combating the climate crisis? Who gets those jobs and whether those jobs are good jobs? We don't want a tiny CCC that continues racialized capitalism and is run by profit-driven private corporations. We want a CCC that invests in communities on the front lines of these crises of our times and creates pathways to joining a union. Winning the best possible version of the CCC would be the biggest win so far for our movement. It's ambitious, but it's also a winnable fight. And though the amount of Markey's bill is significant at $130 billion, it's still small within the scheme of the overall package. Finally, it sets us up for future wins. Why? Because this is the most visionary, popular component of the package. Throwing our energy behind the CCC will allow us to tell a bigger story about our government and our country. It'll let us change the realm of what is politically possible, setting us up for further wins down the road. Here's a snazzy timeline for how things have unfolded in 2021 so far. Starting on the political side with Biden in office, we got some great wins with his executive orders. Then came the COVID relief package, followed by Biden's introduction of his initial proposal for the infrastructure package. At the end of April, we worked with our Green New Deal champs in Congress to reintroduce the Green New Deal resolution and roll out a bill for the civilian climate accord that our generation needs. Now, over to the Good Jobs for All campaign side of things. At the end of March, we kicked off the campaign demanding our members of Congress take the Good Jobs for All pledge. In April, we held our Day of Action, the largest in movement history, and in May, sunrisers from across the Gulf South and California began their treks, walking hundreds of miles to bring their demands straight to the halls of power. This month, hubs across the country are leading teach-ins with their community about what good jobs would mean for their region. And at the same time, we are looking forward to our treks culminating in moments of action, followed by a movement-wide escalation focused in Washington, D.C. on the 28th. This is how we will build people power. Let's take a moment to appreciate the progress we've made and show some excitement for the progress to come. Can I see some plus signs in the chat for all of the work we've done? Come on, people, let's see it. Yep, that's nice. All of that. All of that energy, and that's the energy we need to have. Great. So now we're taking all these amazing actions and building people power. But what are our demands? Here are our demands right now. No compromises, no excuses. Democrats must take their power seriously and do what's needed with or without the GOP. If that means eliminating the filibuster, firing the Senate parliamentarian, or using budget reconciliation, so be it. Our next demand: meet with the people who elected you. We demand that Biden set up a meeting with Varshini Prakash, executive director of Sunrise Movement, and other leaders of our movement to hear our demands on infrastructure and negotiate with us. And lastly, fully fund the Civilian Climate Corps. This moment demands bold action and a significant infrastructure package to stop climate change and create millions of good jobs in the process. That is why we needed a fully funded Civilian Climate Corps to put over 1.5 million Americans to work in good-paying union jobs while combating climate change and building a sustainable future for our generation, all while giving us hope for the future and changing how we see the government. All right, y'all, we're nearing the end of things. So before we move on, I'm gonna ask that we join together in some collective visioning. We ready to do that? Let me see y'all drop some yeses in the chat if you're ready to do some collective visioning. All right. Great. Looks like we are. All right. I'll give everyone a moment to close their eyes. Take this time to center yourselves in this space. Listen to the words I say. Remember earlier on in the teach-in when Angela asked you, what comes to your mind when you think of the Green New Deal? And remember the world that AOC described in her video. A world that existed where you could live, work, play, and dream, absent the fear of impending climate catastrophe. Go back to that world. Expand on it. Think about a world where people were free society was kind and we lived in community with one another. A world that exists absent oppression. Remember those visions of a better world. Reminisce about the beauty of that world's potential. Now, think about that world and compare it to where we are today. What did it take to get there? What did you organize? Where did you organize? How did you organize? What did you do after you led teach-ins in your community? Think about the fight it took to get to that better world. What did we do to force Biden's hand? What were the risks and the actions that we took to polarize the public and make them see the future we all believe in? How did we confront those in power and force them to acknowledge the desires of the overwhelming majority of Americans? How did we agitate and create a world where we fought to embrace democracy and passed legislation to make that better world a reality? Consider the time and effort, the sacrifices that we made to correct the mistakes of those who failed us in the past. Think about what you had to do in order to win a Green New Deal. All right, you can open your eyes. Wow, I want to know what everyone saw. I want to hear about your visions of the escalations and actions. Drop them in the chat about the fight to achieve that better world. I'd love to see what everybody believed in, what they would do. Let me hear from you. Community power, community demonstrations, doing the right thing, local actions, tapping into our morality as humans, door knocking, sharing, cooperation, text banking, exactly. Yeah, perfect. Community organizing. You all have some amazing visions of what we have to do to get to that place. I know that when I did this, I saw any number of visions. I saw escalation and action and pressure. I saw occupation of offices and bird dogging of senators and representatives. I saw crowds and marches and speakers gathering together united in a call for good jobs and freedom. After a long, devastating year, I saw sunrise returning to its roots and reinvigorating a nation. That is our mission. That's why this campaign is so necessary, because in order to get to this future, as depicted in this image, we have to do this. We have to organize. So let's do just that, organize. All of those actions you thought of, you can make them happen. Let's be just as bold and ambitious with our organizing as we are with our vision and hope of a better world. Let's organize and fight, because when we fight, we win. Let's look at a couple of ways for folks to plug in and into that fight happening right now. So first, you can host your own teach-in and add it to the map. We are going to support hubs like yours all across the movement. You'll have the opportunity to talk to your community about what the Green New Deal and what the Civilian Climate Corps could do for you. Go to this link, which will be dropped in the chat, to find the one-stop shop for hosting a teach-in. This is only the kickoff teach-in, and we've already got more than 10 hubs hosting their own local one. Let's see how many we can get in the next week. Let us know in the chat if you are excited to hold a teach-in in your community. I want to see where y'all come from and where you think you can change things. Nice job, Jason. I can't wait to see what you're going to do. I'm very excited to see all of, us taking action collectively, teaching our communities about what is going to happen. I can't wait to see all of you in your communities talking with folks about the Good Jobs for All campaign. the Civilian Climate Corps, and a Green New Deal. So what else can we do? You can call your members of Congress and tell them to sign the Good Jobs for All pledge to build support for our demands, and then hold them accountable when the legislation is debated. You can also use the power of digital organizing. Now, all right, everyone, I know you've got a phone, and I know you've at least got a Twitter, and if you don't, make one. For the sake of digital organizing and uplifting the message, let's take out our phones, open these apps, and follow these organizations and post about Line 3 and the treks on our social media. I'm gonna open up this space so y'all can do it. We can do it right now. Use these hashtags to elevate and highlight these actions. We've got over 100 people on here. I know that if we spread the word to our friends and post it ourselves, we could actually get these hashtags trending and uplift the great work that these organizers are doing right now as we speak. So I'm gonna give y'all a moment to tweet something or two, and we can move forward after that. Very excited to see y'all post. All right. On that note, you can also join the RAISE team as a way to push for the CCC online if folks are unable to take action in person. The link is on the screen, but it will also be provided for you in the chat. In addition to all the other things I just noted, we're also going to do some major things. We've got some major plans. We're gearing up for a big action on the 28th of June in DC, after the Gulf South and the California treks end, in big actions in Houston and San Francisco. We need to show up in big numbers and get ready to escalate to force Biden's hand and win the first pillar of the Green New Deal. We'll share more soon and want to talk to hubs and leaders about what exactly the 28th could look like, and need to start recruiting right now. The 28th is going to be here before we know it, so sign up at the link provided and retweet the post that was dropped in the chat. Something that's very important and an opportunity for us to all demonstrate the solidarity and uplift the movement. All right, a reminder for everyone, by the way, this is not the end of the teach-in. We're going to have a Q&A after this section, as you've been reminded throughout this entire event. So stick around with questions to ask our amazing panelists. All right, everyone. This campaign, this movement is kicking into high gear. It's time to remind everyone what Sunrise is all about. Join me as we celebrate. Let's do this. Have a panel for Q&A coming up next. Just give us a bit to get it together.
Okay, do we have Julie to ask the first question? Julie, are you there?
I am here. I'm just taking a look at some of the Q&A that we've put up. And so the first question that I will ask to our panelists, although we addressed it in the Q&A, I think it's a very popular question that I think everyone should hear. And the question comes from Rachel around, will undocumented folks have access to the good, clean jobs that we are fighting for? Bree?
Yeah, I'm really glad this question was asked because, yeah, I think nothing is guaranteed. And if we want these jobs to be accessible to everyone, we're going to have to fight for them. And just the same way that we are like trying to make the CCC politically inevitable, we need to make sure that it's really clear and all of the organizing that we're doing, targeting Biden, targeting our members of Congress and our senators, that we're communicating that it's important that these jobs are accessible to everyone, are accessible to undocumented folks. And so, yeah, that's part of why we do this education, so that we get everyone on the same page, that we need to not repeat the same mistakes of the past. And yeah, it's up to us organizing to make the Green New Deal and the CCC that we deserve politically possible. So I know that's probably feels like a little bit of a cop-out answer, but that's the reality that we have. We've got to organize.
Fantastic. Another really popular question that came up that I think we all need to address and talk about as a group comes from David. And the question is, what is Sunrise currently doing in relation to Senators Manchin's and Sinema's intransigence on the filibuster? And in my opinion, delusion about the possibility of good faith bipartisanship with the Republican Party. I'm in California, so I feel powerless to do anything about Senator Manchin's uniquely West Virginian political sensibilities.
I'm happy to start with this one too, and would love to throw it to anyone else if you want to add on to it. But yeah, also a great question. Also one that I think a lot of us are feeling. Just like, these fake Democrats, right? Getting in the way. So part of the answer that I wrote for David, and that hopefully y'all can see, is that right now we feel pretty optimistic about the budget reconciliation process as a way to pass the American Jobs Plan, and know that Biden and Democrats could pass some really ambitious legislation through that process. And it's a little bit wonky. I won't go too much into it, but if you Google it, there's a great article by Vox recently, and you can learn a little bit more about that. But yeah, this is part of the reason. I think I linked some stuff. I was actually at the White House yesterday with like 60 or so other Sunrisers, and we blockaded the road into the White House because we're really angry that Biden has been negotiating with Republicans and sending the signal that we do need to work together, that that's possible, that they aren't the party that has been obstructing us for on absolutely everything for years in office. So we don't need to work with Republicans, and we need to make that message really clear to Biden especially. And I think part of the power analysis that we have is that Biden is the president of the US and is, is the most powerful person in the Democrats. And so if we can, we've been sending a really clear message to him that he needs to take us seriously and listen to the young people who delivered the presidency to him. And so I think I think, David, you asked this from California, and so I'm not going to ask you to come, but people in driving distance of DC, you got to join us on June 28th. We've sort of put that out as a threat that if you don't start taking us seriously and moving forward with this budget reconciliation strategy, we are going to be there on June 28th, hopefully by the thousands. And we're not going to let you get away with this. But yeah, I think it's also important to power map the rest of the Democratic Party. And of course, it's really, Nancy Pelosi is also obviously holds a lot of power in the Democrats and in the House. And so I think, yeah, y'all in California have a lot of work to do there to make sure she gets the message. And I know that the trek in California is going to be wrapping up some exciting action. So hopefully, David, you could go and participate in that. And I know that folks in New York are really putting the heat on Schumer as well. And so we've got to sort of like target those big players who can leverage their influence within the party to make sure that we're actually just like moving forward with this window of political opportunity that we have right now. Yeah, do any of the other panelists have anything to add to that?
I can add. One of the things that I think that Bree spoke about and touched on that I think is really important is about looking at what we have on our own, hands. She mentioned California. California has the largest congressional delegation, and one of those happens to, and both of the people who lead both parties of the congressional delegation are the Speaker of the House and the House Minority Leader. So one of the things that is important for you to do is think about how you can organize and put pressure on those who are in your own local areas. So also consider this. The House Democrats have a very narrow margin by which they hold the majority. At the same time, the Senate is split 50-50. Joe Manchin and Kyrsten Sinema don't have as much power as they have right now if we elect Green New Deal champions who promise to eliminate the filibuster. 2 senators who commit to that, which would be an extraordinary achievement for the entire movement, ensure that we can be even more ambitious than what we are asking for with the Civilian Climate Corps right now. So going into 2022, we're halfway through the year, in June right now, we have to think about what does it look like for us to organize and put continued pressure on the politicians in power right now. And in addition to that, organizing to elect people to prevent those who would stand in the way of us creating opportunities like the Civilian Climate Corps right now.
That's brilliant. Yeah, I think all of those also answer specific questions that we also got in the Q&A with regards to what people can do locally. And joining the Sunrise Rays is also a great way to get involved and make local change. All right, let's see. Let me take this next question from Heather, who works for the Washington Conservation Corps. And that Conservation Corps is based on the CCC, and they exist all over the US. So Heather says that their pay in Washington is $13.50 an hour, and it's in the contract that they can't form a union, which is also a 2-year maximum. She's curious if the new CCC will be an expansion of these AmeriCorps jobs or run tangentially. And Heather is very excited about the new CC having union jobs and a living wage.
I'm also happy to take a crack at this one, but as I noted in the answer that I gave you, Heather, I'm like, yeah, this is not my strong suit. I think I'm often thinking about how do we get the thing passed and not like, oh, like when we do, what does it look like? But that is going to be super important. Yeah, hopefully, if we win. But yeah, I'm curious if anyone else has a different perspective on this, but I imagine that it will be some of working within existing like structures and some of creating new structures. But yeah, I think your experience really highlights why a demand that we have is that they're good paying union jobs with that are paid a minimum wage, because we deserve nothing less and actually a whole lot more. So anyone else got a good perspective on that?
I have a little bit. One thing that always happens, we organize in movements like ours. We organize in order to get the most ambitious, piece of legislation that reflects our priorities possible. And if we want that to include ensuring that the Civilian Climate Corps is creates an opportunity for workers to unionize, we have to ensure that that's a part of it. However, a lot of the times is we put all that momentum towards just getting that thing on the agenda and then getting it through to passage, that we don't oftentimes think about what happens post the passage of the bill. Passing the bill is just part of the fight. We also have to think about what happens after that. And during that time, which is between, let's say it gets passed out of the Senate and it gets passed out of the House, and then before the signing, there's a period of time where the House and the Senate have to reconcile their different versions of what the Civilian Climate Corps looks like. So during that moment, we should continue as a movement to push for a reflected bill that says what we want as a movement. It means we don't let up the pressure even after we get it on the Senate floor, get it off on the House floor, get it passed off the House floor, and get it passed off the Senate floor. There's that in-between process that we have to be certain that we're a part of and that we're influencing all the time. And then when it gets on the Biden's desk, we make sure that the bill that is signed reflects the priorities that we have just indicated, including ensuring that all the workers